At 3:47 p.m., on a mild spring Thursday in Elkwood, Oregon, a young girl disappeared without a trace. There were no screams, no loud noises, just sudden, unsettling quiet. One moment, she was outside in the backyard, drawing hearts with chalk. On the patio, the next her crayons were scattered, and she was gone. By 4:03, her mother had dialed 911. At 4:22, a German Shepherd named Rex was on the scene, catching the scent. And by 5:09, that dog would accomplish something no person could. The neighborhood looked like any peaceful suburb lined with tulip trees, flags fluttering gently on porches, and kids zipping by on scooters. It was the sort of place where barbecue happened midweek, just because, and people rarely locked their doors, which made what happened all the more terrifying. Sophie Green, just 6 years old, had vanished without a single sound. Her mother, Melissa, had been inside folding laundry. At the time, the baby monitor was on, not really necessary anymore, but it gave her peace of mind. She had one ear tuned to it, and one eye on a stack of tiny socks. She remembered softly singing along to a cheerful TV commercial, only to suddenly notice how unnaturally quiet the house had become. When she stepped outside, Sophie was no longer on the patio. Not under the tree. Not at the swing set. Not anywhere. Melissa called her name, first gently Sophie, then louder, still nothing. Her panic rising, she ran toward the fence, her heart pounding, and began knocking on neighbors' doors, asking if anyone had seen her daughter. A few children said they'd seen Sophie earlier, showing off her drawings with a big smile. That was maybe 15 minutes ago. Melissa's hands trembled as she dialed the police. Officer Mark Ellis was the first responder. He'd grown up in Elkwood, himself a town where serious crimes were almost unheard of. Missing persons, abductions, those were things that happened somewhere else. But when dispatch mentioned a 6-year-old who'd disappeared without a sound or witness, Mark felt a weight settle in his gut. He brought Rex with him. Rex wasn't an ordinary dog. He was trained to locate missing people, track suspects, and detect drugs. But more than that, he had an uncanny instinct, one Mark had long since learned to trust. When they arrived, Melissa met them on the porch, her face streaked with tears. She was just here, she kept repeating. I only went inside for a second. She was drawing chalk hearts. Look, her crayons are still there. The colorful pieces were scattered near a half-finished heart. Next to the words I love Mum, scrawled faintly on the ground, Rex sniffed. The air, ears up, tail stiff. Mark crouched beside Melissa. We're going to find her, he said gently. I need something of hers, a shirt, sock, anything she wore today. Melissa hurried inside and returned with a small yellow t-shirt, its unicorn print faded and peeling. Rex took a long sniff, huffed, and then darted off. They followed him past the backyard fence, but instead of heading to the street or nearby park, Rex did something unexpected. He doubled back and began circling the garage. Mark frowned. What's he doing? Melissa was confused. There's nothing back there, just the storage unit. It's locked. But Rex didn't care. He paced, sniffed, whined, and scratched at the garage door before darting toward a narrow side yard where a path led to an old, neglected tool shed. Is this part of your property? Mark asked. Technically, yes. But it's falling apart. I haven't used it since last winter. Rex barked once, then again, louder. His nose pressed hard against the doorframe. Mark stepped forward and tried the handle. It was stuck. Locked. Melissa nodded. Always has been. Mark shone his flashlight through a dirt-smeared window. Dust floated in the beam. Boxes, old cans, nothing visibly out of place. Then Rex growled a deep, guttural sound, different from any they'd heard earlier. Mark radioed for bolt cutters. 3 minutes later, the shed was open. It appeared empty, but Rex didn't pause. He moved straight to the far wall, nose low to the ground. A few moving boxes had fallen over in one corner. Stay back, Mark said to Melissa. Let him do his job. Rex approached slowly, every step deliberate. Then he froze. Nose pressed to the floorboards, he lay down, letting out a soft whine. That was his signal, he'd found something. Mark knelt beside the dog. No visible entrance, no cellar door, nothing broken. Any vents? Crawl spaces? Anything under this shed? He asked. Melissa looked pale. There might be a vent out back, but it's small. Too small for a person. Not too small for a dog. They went around to the rear of the shed and found it. A rusted mesh air vent. Mark tore the covering loose and helped Rex squeeze through. Go, he whispered. For nearly 4 minutes, nothing. Then a bark. 2. Silence. Mark leaned close, trying to listen. Then came a faint sound, a dull thump, a scratch, and finally something softer. A small, broken sob. Melissa gasped. Did you hear that? Mark nodded, already calling it in. We have signs of life. Repeat, signs of life. Send thermal imaging and medical immediately. He didn't wait. With Melissa's permission, Mark and 2 other officers began pulling up the floorboards. The space below was dim, but what they found stopped them cold. There was Sophie, curled up beside a heater vent, arms wrapped around a stuffed giraffe, her face tear-streaked, lips cracked from crying. She looked up slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Doggy, she said. Then she passed out. They carried her out carefully. Officer Ellis held her like she might break, her breathing faint, fingers loosely clutching the giraffe. Behind them, Rex never strayed far, alert and watchful. It wasn't over, not yet. Minutes later, medics arrived. Blue and red lights flickered. Across the tree-lined street, casting long shadows over a neighborhood forever changed, they rushed Sophie into the ambulance. Her small frame limp in the medic's arms. Melissa tried to follow, but her legs gave out halfway up the step. A medic caught her just in time. She's stable, he said firmly. Severely dehydrated, but no visible injuries. We'll run a full panel. Melissa nodded slowly, her face blank, not with fear anymore, but with disbelief. As the ambulance pulled away, sirens fading into the evening, she turned to Officer Mark Ellis. She was under the floor, she whispered. I've lived here 7 years. I didn't even know that space existed. You're not alone, Mark replied gently. There's no record of a substructure. Nothing shows up on your property reports or the building plans. They looked back toward the shed. Officers were already roping off the area with yellow tape. Inside, a forensic team began documenting every corner, but no one, not even now, could explain how Sophie ended up in a sealed crawlspace no one knew was there and how only Rex had known where to find her. They gave Rex water first, then offered him a piece of jerky, which he ignored. He paced the driveway, alert and restless, returning again and again to the back of the shed. At one point, he barked once at the far corner, then let out a soft whine and looked up at Mark. You're still not satisfied, are you? Mark murmured, crouching beside him. Rex's ears were high, eyes sharp, muscles tense. Mark knew that look. This wasn't pride in a job well done. Rex was saying something was still off, something had been missed. At the hospital, Sophie woke. About an hour after arriving, a nurse found Melissa seated in the waiting area, hands folded tightly like she was praying. She's asking for you. The nurse said gently. Melissa sprang up and nearly stumbled on her way down the hallway. The room was dim and quiet except for the rhythmic click of the 4. Sophie's eyes fluttered open as her mother entered and a faint smile pulled at her lips. You came, she whispered. Melissa leaned down and pressed her forehead to her daughter's. The sob that escaped had been building since the moment Sophie vanished. I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. Sophie blinked, her voice barely audible. Where's the doggy? Melissa let out a shaky laugh. He's okay, he found you, sweetheart. Everyone says he's a hero. But Sophie didn't smile. Her eyes widened slightly, like she'd remembered something. No, she said quietly. I heard him. Melissa pulled back. You heard him? Sophie nodded. Before he barked, I was crying into the wall, and then I stopped. I started whispering. What did you say? I said, please, someone hear me. Then I heard the doggy scratching. Melissa stared at her, remembering what Mark had told her, how Rex had frozen before he barked, how he'd listened first. And now, this little girl, barely 6 years old, was saying that through layers of wood and insulation, the dog had heard her whisper. Back at the house, Mark stood outside the shed as the forensic team finished scanning the crawlspace. No footprints inside, one technician reported, puzzled. No handprints either, just the girls. Mark narrowed his eyes. Anything on the lock? Just the mother's. She said she last opened it about a week ago to get some holiday decorations. That checks out. No tampering, no signs it was forced. Then how did Sophie get in? Mark asked. The tech could only shrug. We don't know. But we don't know wasn't good enough. As the sun began to set, Mark walked the perimeter again with Rex. This time, he didn't focus on the obvious doors, fences, windows, but on the air, the ground. The breeze carried faint hints of oil and pine. Rex suddenly stopped at the side gate. He sniffed, then growled, low. Mark crouched, studying the mulch. It was disturbed barely, but enough. Drag marks. A boot print. Then another. Not a child's. Larger, deep treads. And they led away from the shed. Later that evening, Mark reviewed what security footage he could get. The Greens' cameras weren't much help. The doorbell cam showed only the front yard. The backyard camera hadn't recorded in over a week, the batteries had died. But something else turned up. Across the street, a neighbor had a dashboard camera mounted on their car. When Mark knocked on their door, around 9:30 that night, the Manor retired firefighter was quick to help. At 3:32 p.m., just minutes before Sophie went missing, the dashcam recorded a plain white work van pulling onto the street. No logo, dented bumper, tinted windows. It idled for about 2 minutes. Then it slowly turned into the Greens' driveway, just out of frame. It never reappeared on camera. There was no footage of anyone getting in or out. No license plate visible. No one could confirm seeing it leave. The next morning, at the precinct, Mark sat with Rex at his feet as he went over everything with his team. No concrete proof of an abduction, no forced entry, no sounds, no witnesses, nothing but a child found in a place she couldn't have reached on her own, and a dog who knew exactly where to go. It wasn't over. Not yet. Mark drew a circle around a single word in his notebook. Intent. Whoever had moved Sophie hadn't done so in panic. Nothing was broken, no mess left behind. She was placed in a hidden spot, the door locked behind her, and the person left without a trace. Why would someone do that? Mark wondered aloud. A bad joke, or something more serious? He glanced at Rex. You saved her, he murmured. The dog cocked his head slightly. You heard her. By noon, the news had already made its way onto local stations. Police dog rescues child hidden beneath shed. But the headlines missed the most important part. Rex hadn't found her just by scent. He had listened. Amid the chaos, sirens, radios, barking, frantic voices, Rex had tuned everything out and picked up on the quietest sound imaginable. The faint voice of a frightened little girl whispering through the dark. And that made all the difference. That night, Sophie didn't want to sleep in her room. Melissa sat on the edge of the bed, gently brushing her hair. I can't go underneath again, Sophie said softly. You won't, sweetheart, Melissa assured her. You're safe now. Can the dog come visit? Melissa gave her a small smile. Maybe. We'll see. Just before Sophie drifted off, she whispered something else, something Melissa wouldn't share until much later. There was someone else, the little girl said. I think I saw boots. In a small town like Elkwood, word travels fast. By Friday morning, everyone had heard. The green-eyed girl had been found alive. A police dog had discovered her. There was no break-in, no ransom note, only unanswered questions and quiet speculation. But Mark Ellis wasn't interested in gossip. He was at his desk, coffee half gone, eyes fixed on a frozen frame from a neighbor's dashcam. Frame 403, a white van sat parked, its engine idling. The timestamp Read 3 hours, 32 minutes and 18 seconds p.m. Sophie had gone missing at 3:47. That gave someone just enough time to lure a child away and hide her somewhere no adult would think to check. What kept Mark up the night before, though, was a boot print left in the mulch. Rex hadn't forgotten either. The department had already completed a background check on Melissa Green. She had a clean record, worked remotely for an online education company, and had no apparent enemies or disputes. No sign of Sophie's father. He'd been out of the picture since the pregnancy. The dashcam hadn't captured anyone exiting the van. No license plate either. The angle missed the back completely. Mark opened a newly arrived lab report. Mulch, sample, partial tread print, deep, men's size 11. Possible Red Wing work boots. Common, yes but not meaningless. He sipped his coffee again. Cold. At 9:17 a.m., the station phone rang. "Hi, this is Melissa Green. Sorry to bother you. Sophie said something odd this morning." Mark sat upright. "What was it?" she said. "The man had a cough." Mark paused. "What man?" "She didn't call him that exactly. She said the person with the boots coughed a lot." He jotted the detail down. "She didn't see his face," Melissa continued. "Said it was dark." He grabbed her arm. At first, she thought it was a game. Then suddenly, she was in the crawl space. "Did she mention being hurt?" "No, but she said she could hear him breathing through the vent while she cried." A chill ran down Mark's spine. "I'm coming over," he said. "Can you ask if she remembers any smells or sounds other than the coughing?" "Sure," Melissa replied. "She's coloring right now. I'll be there in 20. Melissa lived at the end of a cul-de-sac in a modest ranch-style home. She answered the door wearing jeans and a hoodie, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked exhausted. "She's doing better today," she said, leading Mark inside. "Eating, talking, but she's not the same." Sophie was seated at the coffee table, coloring a picture of a dog. Mark recognized it. It looked just like Rex. "Sophie," he said gently. She looked up, curious but not afraid. "Hi, officer." "Hi, sweetheart," he smiled. "That's a great drawing." "That's Rex," she said proudly. "He heard me." "He sure did." Mark sat down across from her, moving slowly. "Your mum told me someone was there with you when you were hiding." Sophie nodded, still coloring Rex's tail. "He had boots." "Did you hear his voice?" "No," she said. "But he coughed a lot, like he was sick." She paused. "It sounded like Grandpa when he used to smoke too much, all scratchy." Mark scribbled down the description. "Did he say anything to you?" She hesitated. "One thing." "He waited," he said. "Don't scream." Mark felt his stomach tighten. "Did he smell like anything?" Sophie wrinkled her nose. "Like those soap bars in gas stations, the green kind." "I don't like them." Mark blinked. "The kind in public restrooms?" She nodded. "They smell gross." That afternoon, Mark pulled security footage from every gas station within a 5-mile radius of the Green home. Only one had cameras covering the restrooms, a chevron, tucked between the main road and the high school. He got lucky, at 3:26 p.m. On the day Sophie disappeared, a white van with a dented front bumper pulled into the lot. No front license plate. The driver didn't fuel up, just parked by the restroom entrance. At 3:28, a tall man in jeans, a black hoodie, and work boots exited the men's room and he coughed. Not loud, but audible through the mic. Harsh and dry. Mark paused the footage. The man's hood was up. His face was hidden. But the timeline fit. Van arrives. Man uses restroom. Smells like soap. Leaves. Heads straight toward the neighborhood. The evidence spoke for itself. Mark forwarded the video to the FBI field office in Portland. Local authorities would be taking over, but he wasn't backing off. Not after what Rex had done. That evening, Mark walked the perimeter of the Green property with Rex again. The dog was alert, nose low, scanning the ground. At the shed, Rex stopped, sniffed the air, let out a low growl, then bolted toward the eastern fence where the tracks had been found the day before. "Rex!" Mark shouted, but the shepherd jumped against the fence. Pawing at the wood, Mark caught up and saw something wedged behind a bush, a rag, crumpled and dirty. He pulled on gloves and picked it up. It had a faint scent: soap and sweat. It must have been used to wipe down the van's door handle. Sloppy, but useful. By Monday, the forensic lab had results. Partial DNA match in CODIS. The name came back. Travis Lenny, 37. Prior charges: burglary, petty theft, and 1 count of attempted abduction dismissed. Last known address: Vancouver, Washington. Too close for comfort. Mark stared at the photo in front of him. The man looked frail, underweight, his brown hair oily and unkempt, with hollow cheeks. Every mugshot showed the same. Red Wing work boots on his feet. The picture was coming together. That same night, FBI agents located Lenny at a roadside motel. Along the interstate, he was asleep in the back of a white van, engine cold, rear doors carelessly left unlocked. There were no signs of another child, but the evidence was there. A rope, zip ties, a discarded candy wrapper, and a handwritten list of addresses. One of them belonged to the Green family. When Melissa got the news, she sat in her car outside the hospital, her hands shaking. "He was watching us," she whispered. Mark nodded slowly. "We think he'd been watching the neighborhood for days." "But how did he know about the crawlspace?" she asked. "We don't believe he did," Mark replied. "Our theory is, he needed somewhere to stash her fast and quiet." She looked up at him. "If your dog hadn't, I know." They sat in silence for a while. Rex lay beside the car, ears twitching at every bird call, every passing sound. He was still on Alatorways listening. That night, Mark brought Rex home and cooked him a steak. No kibble, no treats. A full grilled sirloin. Rex devoured it quickly, then curled up beside the couch, letting out a deep sigh that sounded like relief. "You did good," Mark said, stroking the dog's head. "You didn't just find her, you heard what no one else could." Though the trial was still months away. The headlines came quickly. K-9 officer saves child in near abduction. Hero dog tracks down missing girl hidden under shed, she whispered through the floorboards, and a dog heard her. Rex became a local celebrity. His story made the rounds: local news, national segments, even a nod from a late-night host. But despite the attention, his routine never changed. He still stretched at exactly 5:15 each morning. He still barked at squirrels behind the station's south fence. And he still sat loyally beside Officer Mark Ellis, just like always. But Mark felt the difference. Something had shifted. Not in Rex, but in himself. The morning after Lenny's arrest, Mark stopped by the greenhouse. Not as a detective, not on duty. Just a man bringing a dog to visit a little girl who wanted to say thank you. Melissa answered the door with a tired smile, a mug of black coffee in hand. "She hasn't stopped talking about him," she said, nodding toward the living room. She even renamed her stuffed giraffe. "It's Rex Jr. now," Mark smiled. "I think he'd be proud of that." Inside, Sophie was waiting by the couch, wearing an oversized t-shirt with a cartoon German Shepherd on it. As soon as she spotted Rex, her entire face lit up. "Rex!" she shouted, running toward him with the kind of joy that only a child who's known real fear can feel. Rex patted over, tail wagging, eyes warm. He let her throw her arms around his neck, press her cheek to his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stood still and let her hold him as long as she needed. Mark swallowed hard. It hit him then, this wasn't just about a rescue, this was about healing. They spent time on the porch that afternoon. Melissa sat on the steps, Mark beside her, Rex resting quietly at their feet, while Sophie played with chalk on the driveway. But this time, she wasn't drawing alone. This time, there were 2 dogs in her picture, one with a badge, one with a pink collar. "I think I want to be a dog doctor," she said, coloring Rex's tail purple. Melissa smiled. "A vet, yeah, but only for heroes." Back at the station, the mood was much heavier. The FBI had finished going through everything found in Lenny's van and motel room. Among the items, a notebook stood out, and it changed everything. Inside were 5 names. All girls, ages 4 to 9, all living within 50 miles of Elkwood. Sophie's name was second on the list. It included her age, her school, a rough sketch of her house, and an X marked over the shed. This wasn't a random crime. It had been carefully planned. Lenny wasn't someone who seized opportunities, he was a predator. The other names were kept confidential in public reports, but the department had already placed those families under temporary protection. Mark stared at the page. Each child's entry had a spot labeled Access and another labeled Escape. Next to Sophie's name, there was an extra line, 4 words, too quiet, needs sound. That one sentence made Mark's blood freeze. Lenny hadn't just been looking for weak locks or easy targets, he studied silence. He relied on it, and in the end, it was the faintest sound, barely more than a whisper, that gave him away. A whisper that Rex had heard. The following week, the town of Elkwood honored Rex with a medal in a public ceremony. It took place in the city park, under the old war memorial by the lake. Children lined up to pet him. News crews tried coaxing him to bark for the camera. One woman even brought a bone-shaped peanut butter cake. Rex wasn't interested. He just sat beside Mark, tongue out, posture proud like the seasoned partner he was. Mark let the ceremony run its course. He shook hands, gave the required statements, smiled when appropriate. But deep down, he knew one thing: no medal, no headline, no spotlight could ever capture what really happened. Rex didn't just find a missing girl. He listened on that saved her life. Once it was all over, Mark and Rex strolled along the edge of the woods. The silence was a relief. No cameras, no interviews, no one watching. "Do you understand what you did?" Mark said out loud. Rex didn't reply, naturally. He simply looked up, let out a quiet breath, and leaned against Mark's leg. That was enough. That evening, back home, Mark opened an envelope he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a photograph of his younger self holding a leash attached to a yellow Labrador. His first canine partner, Casey. She'd passed away 3 years earlier, peacefully in her sleep on a blanket beside his bed. Mark didn't even realize. He was crying until Rex wandered over and gently touched his nose to the photo. "She was a good one," Mark murmured. Rex licked the edge of the picture, then curled up beside Mark's boot. 2 days later, Melissa called again. "Mark, sorry to bother you," she said. "Sophie wants to send something to Rex." He smiled. "Of course, what is it?" "A letter." She wanted to deliver it herself. Inside the envelope was a drawing on pink construction paper. It showed Rex, with angel wings, drawn in bold marker. At the top, in big, uneven handwriting, it said, "You're the only one who heard me." And beneath it, "Thank you for listening." Mark pinned it to the bulletin board above his desk. Each time his eyes landed on it, something in his chest loosened. But Rex's work wasn't done. The story had more to reveal. Later that week, Mark got a call from a detective up in Vancouver. "We raided a property Lenny visited 3 times. This month," the detective said. Mark straightened in his chair. "And there's a cellar involved." There was a pause. Same kind of setup. Hidden door, soundproofed walls, a collar chain anchored into the concrete. Mark shut his eyes. How many kids? None inside, but ... there were toys. A pink blanket. A bottle of shampoo. Another heavy silence. Whatever you did, it stopped him from using it. Mark didn't respond. He looked down. Rex was under the desk, one paw crossed over the other. The dog opened a single eye and looked up. Mark reached down and gently scratched behind his ears. "You heard what no one else did," he whispered. "And that, more than any weapon or badge, is what saved her." 3 weeks had passed since Sophie had whispered through the floor and a dog had answered. To the rest of the country, it was a fleeting news story. A heartwarming headline about a brave canine. But in Elkwood, Oregon, the impact still lingered. People kept their children a little closer. Locking doors became second nature. Security cameras were installed where none had been before. And whenever Officer Mark Ellis and Rex walked through town, people waved, kids pointed. Parents gave small, quiet nods that carried more meaning than words. But, for Sophie Green, it wasn't about being rescued by a dog, it was about a dog who listened, but Melissa Green had begun taking Sophie to therapy not because something was wrong with her, but because something had happened that no 6-year-old should ever endure. She didn't want Sophie to carry it alone. The therapist, Dr. Harper, was warm and gentle. Her office was filled with toys, and she allowed Sophie to speak at her own pace. But after 2 sessions, Sophie had only managed to full sentences. About Rex, he heard me, she said. His ears were the only ones that knew. Melissa mentioned this to Mark during a phone call one late afternoon. She hadn't meant to cry, but the emotion caught her off guard. I wish she'd open up to someone, anyone. There was a pause. Then Mark said, "Let me bring him." That Tuesday morning was sunny when Rex walked into Dr. Harper's office as if he belonged there. The moment Sophie saw him, she beamed. She dropped her crayons, ran across the room, and knelt beside him. Rex nudged her cheek with his nose, then lay beside her, legs stretched out, eyes calm. Dr. Harper blinked. "Well," she said softly, "this might be my easiest session yet." Sophie didn't speak right away. She just stroked Rex's ears in silence. Then, gradually, she began to talk. Not in a rush, not loudly. One sentence at a time, one memory after another. She spoke about the shadows in the shed, about the voice that told her not to scream, the endless hours curled into herself, whispering until her throat hurt, and finally, about the scratching she heard from above and how she just knew the dog on the other side of the floor wasn't just looking for her. He was hearing her. By the time the session ended, Dr. Harper's eyes were damp. Outside, Melissa was waiting, hugging herself tightly as Mark stepped out with Rex. "She talked," he said softly. The whole time, Melissa broke down. "You," Mark looked at Rex. "Don't thank me." From then on, Rex became a regular in Sophie's therapy sessions. Every Tuesday at 10 a.m., he lay on the same rug with his head resting on his paws while Sophie drew pictures, asked questions, and slowly released all the tangled thoughts inside her. Sometimes she spoke about dreams, sometimes about school, how the other kids treated her like a superhero, even when she didn't feel like one. One day, she whispered something only Rex heard. Dr. Harper didn't ask what it was. She simply noted that Sophie was finding her way back. Meanwhile, Mark was still working closely with the FBI on the Linney case. More evidence came to light. A girl in Vancouver had come forward. She hadn't been taken, but she remembered a white van parked near her bus stop and a man in a hoodie asking if she'd seen a lost puppy. Her parents had taught her well. She ran home, locked the door, and told her mum everything. That had been 2 weeks before Sophie's abduction. Linney had left a trail, intentional, precise, but he wouldn't get another chance. He was now in custody, held without bail. The trial would take time, but justice had begun moving because a 6-year-old made a sound so faint no one else heard it, and a German shepherd refused to ignore it. One afternoon, Mark returned to the station and discovered something unexpected in his mailbox. It was a letter from a family in Montana, people he'd never met. The return address was from a small town he'd never heard of. On the back of the envelope was a tiny paw print sticker. Inside was a photo of a young girl hugging a tan Labrador, along with a handwritten note. "My daughter was attacked last year. She hasn't spoken since. But she saw the story about Rex on the news. She asked to meet a police dog. We drove 6 hours just so she could shake a handler's hand. She didn't say a word at the time, but later that night, she leaned in close to their family dog and whispered, 'He would have found me, too. Thank you for helping us believe again.'" Mark sat quietly with the letter for a long time before finally pinning it next to Sophie's pink construction paper, drawing on the bulletin board. About a month later, the department launched a new community outreach initiative, K9 Comfort Visits. What started as a simple public relations effort quickly turned into something far more meaningful. Police officers partnered with certified K9 units to visit schools, libraries, and community spaces. The goal wasn't to impress, but to show that comfort, courage, and support could come on 4 paws. Rex became the face of the program. Calm, dignified, and always tuned in. Children would gather in circles and read aloud, as Rex lay in the center like a furry badge-wearing pillow, and whenever a child stumbled over a word or hesitated, Rex would gently lift his head, as if to say, "I hear you." One rainy Thursday in June, Melissa reached out to Mark. "I know it's a strange thing to ask," she admitted, a little embarrassed, "but Sophie won't go to her kindergarten graduation unless Rex is there." Mark didn't even pause. Of course they'd be there. They arrived early that morning. Sophie wore a light blue dress with a ribbon to match in her hair. The second she spotted Rex, she ran straight to him and threw her arms around his neck as if it were Christmas morning. She'd even saved him a seat, right next to hers. When the teacher called her name, Sophie stood up, took a deep breath, and asked, "Can Rex come with me?" The teacher smiled. "Of course." And so, the whole auditorium watched as a 6-year-old and a German Shepherd made their way across the stage, side by side. Not one person in the room found it odd. In fact, it felt just right. That evening, as the sun dipped low over Elkwood and families returned to the rhythm of everyday life, Mark sat with Rex on the station steps. They watched the stillness settle over the town. The children were safe. The doors were locked. Parents could finally exhale. "Not bad for a dog, huh?" Mark said, scratching behind Rex's ears. Rex didn't respond. He was listening still. Always. Summertime in Elkwood had always brought the usual joys: barbecues, bare feet on warm grass, lemonade, and sprinklers spinning lazily in yards. But that year, following the rescue, the arrest, and the slow process of healing, it meant something more. It meant new beginnings, not just for Sophie, but for the whole community. Rex officially retired from active duty in late July. It wasn't because he lacked the ability to serve. He still had the drive. But Mark, after 15 years in uniform, recognized when a partner had given more than he ever owed. "He's earned the right to rest," Mark told the chief. The chief simply nodded. Let him retire, knowing he's a legend. Rex didn't mind the slower lifestyle. He still made occasional visits to the station. He still enjoyed his morning strolls, and barked once if a squirrel got too bold near the steps. But now, most of his days were spent lounging on the porch of Mark's farmhouse just outside town, soaking in the sun and drifting in and out of naps. He wasn't chasing suspects anymore, he was chasing butterflies, and that was more than enough. Mark adapted to. After a lifetime of serving others, he was learning to appreciate the stillness, the kind without tension. He started gardening, crafted a porch swing by hand, and even helped coach Little League when the sheriff's son injured his ankle mid-season. But most afternoons, you could find him back at his kitchen table with Rex at his feet, sipping iced tea and quietly rereading Sophie's letter. "You're the only one who heard me." Mark never stopped being grateful for that moment, for that whisper, and for the ears that caught it. Sophie was thriving. The nightmares had faded, replaced by bike rides through the neighborhood. Her once quiet lunches in the school counselor's office had become lively picnics under the sun. She still attended therapy weekly, but now she brought in colorful drawings. Instead of silent fears, pictures of dogs, hearts, and houses beneath bright smiling suns, and in every single drawing, a big-eared German Shepherd appeared in the corner. Dr. Harper once asked, "Why is he always bigger than the people?" "Because he hears more than all of them," Sophie replied. When Melissa heard that, she didn't cry out of sadness. She cried because for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. That fall, the Elkwood County Fair introduced a new tradition: the Rex Hero Award. It was designed to recognize animals who had made a meaningful difference in the lives of people around them. The town council's vote was unanimous. Mark tried to protest, he wasn't fond of the spotlight, but Melissa interrupted. "It's not about him," she said. "It's for the next kid who needs to know someone's paying attention." So they gave Rex the first one. Crafted from cedar, it was engraved with his paw print and the date he found Sophie. The crowd stood and applauded. Rex, unaware of the attention, dozed through most of it. Travis Linney's trial finally happened in November. Mark didn't have to be there. He'd already testified during pretrial, but he went. Anyway, he sat in the back, dressed in his formal blues, eyes steady as the prosecution walked through the evidence, the timeline, the videos, the notebook. At one point, the audio from the shed played again, the faint noise that only Rex had responded to. Not a word, just a breath. But it had been enough. When the jury returned, the verdict was swift, guilty on all charges. Outside the courthouse, Mark didn't feel triumphant, just a quiet sense of peace. Back at the truck, Rex was waiting, tail thumping once against the seat, as if to say, "That's it." We're done. Winter arrived early in Elkwood that year, blanketing the town like powdered sugar. In her yard, Sophie built a snow dog stick ears. Raisin eyes and made a sign that read, "Rex number 1, planting it proudly beside him. A photo of it ran on the front page of the local paper's Christmas edition. But only Melissa noticed that Sophie stayed beside it, long after it started to melt, whispering something and then smiling. Melissa didn't ask what she said. She just held her daughter's hand and stood with her, sharing the stillness. On Christmas Eve, Mark received a letter with no return address. Inside was a drawing crayon on plain printer paper, a little girl hugging a dog. Beneath it, in simple handwriting, "Now I know they hear me too." No name, no signature. Mark placed it beside Sophie's pink letter on the wall above his kitchen table. And he cried, not from sorrow, but because he finally understood. Rex hadn't only saved Sophie, he'd reminded people, kids, parents, entire communities, that someone is always listening. Even when everything feels silent, especially then. The following spring, on a warm afternoon, Mark sat with Rex in a field filled with daisies, the breeze tugging at his sleeves. Sophie had come to visit, wearing overalls and carrying a book she'd written herself. "It's a story about a dog who heard what others didn't," she explained. "I called it The Dog Who Listened." Mark swallowed hard. "You nailed it, kid." Sophie knelt beside Rex, gently stroking his fur. "Is he happy?" she asked. Mark nodded. "I think so." She thought for a moment, then leaned in and whispered something to Rex. Mark couldn't hear it, but Rex did. He raised his head, wagged his tail, and turned his eyes to the sky.